Hello and a warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. Coming up on today's show, we're going to be talking about Donald Trump's impending visit to Scotland, where he'll be meeting both the Prime Minister and the First Minister. Some within the Scottish Parliament think that Mr. Swinney should just give a two-fingered job to Mr. Trump, or should that be a one-fingered job? Should Mr. Swinney meet with him? We'll chew over all of that. Pretty big speech last night at the Mansion House in London, the Chancellor of the Exchequer setting out some plans for further deregulation in the city. But what does it tell us about what might be in the budget later on in the year on a morning where CPI inflation has gone up to 3.6%? And the BBC mired in yet more crisis, this time over MasterChef. Whether it's MasterChef, whether it's Hugh Edwards, whether it's Martin Bashir, a simple question: are they ever capable of policing themselves? That's all ahead in the next 40 minutes or so. But let's start with Trump's visit to Scotland. Alex, what do you make of it?
Well, yes, Mr. Trump comes to Aberdeen to open a second golf course at the many estate Trump International Aberdeen. And so it's a curious visit in as much as it is simultaneously a private visit by the American president, but because he's the president of the United States of America and so on, there is really no such thing as a private visit. And so he has asked, I think, for a meeting with Sir Keir Starmer, the prime minister. And because this is John Swinney's turf, the First Minister is also going to be in the Northeast and is also going to meet the president, whether members of his own party or the Scottish Greens or Scottish Labour or whoever and so on feel that this is something he shouldn't be doing, whether it's humiliating to prostrate himself before an American president of this sort is neither here nor there. It seems to me that when the leader of the free world, for such he remains, whether one likes it or not, comes to town and says, "I'd like to meet you," you have to have a pretty good reason not to meet him, don't you?
Absolutely. I suppose, in a sense, that from the point of view of the Prime Minister, given that this, of course, comes ahead of a state visit by President Trump, where the royals will be schmoozing him as well, it gives, I suppose, Starmer, who's still having a difficult time on the domestic agenda, to be able to remind people that they're finishing off the fine details of a trade deal with the USA on terms which is probably better than the European Union have. I think Starmer likes to be seen to be hobnobbing with world leaders. And it has to be said, in fairness, that his record on international issues, attempting to be an honest broker in a whole series of issues, is probably better than his domestic agenda. It does also appear that there is a degree of warmth in the relationship between Trump and Starmer. Critics of the Prime Minister would say this is because he is too subservient to the American president. Supporters of the Prime Minister will say, hey, look, if stroking the ego of this megalomaniac is the price that you have to pay in order to get a trade deal over the line, in order to ensure that the country is not hit with tariffs. And of course, perhaps one of the issues that they will talk about is tariffs in relation to the steel industry here. Starmer will probably take the view, if I can get deals which are good for the UK, which are good for British workers, which may well be good for the steel industry here, I will stroke his ego all day long if that's what it takes. If it takes involving the sovereign in order to give it a further stroke, as long as it's in the national interest, that is good enough for me. But of course, given that he is a man who is, not to put too fine a point on it, utterly and completely horrible, there will be people that will simply go, "Ugh, yuck, not for me."
Absolutely, but realpolitik is realpolitik, and the national interest takes precedence over, if you like, niceties of diplomatic hygiene. And the same thing applies to John Swinney and so on, who, the First Minister is fully aware that careless remark or two and so on, or a failure to suck up to Trump and so on, could easily provoke the American bear and result in, I don't know, new tariffs being applied to Scotch whiskey and other exports to the United States that would be obviously contrary to what's in the Scottish interest too. And there is, I think we've talked about this before, haven't we? And so there is a sort of painful irony and so on that for 150 years or more and so on, people have looked at the relationship that the Republic of Ireland has had with successive American presidents who claim their Irish ancestry, often quite distant ancestry. Joe Biden was not really actually very Irish. Barack Obama barely Irish at all. Even John F. Kennedy not nearly as Irish as Donald Trump is Scottish. And so after all this time, we finally get an American president with unimpeachable credentials in terms of his connections to Scotland, and this is the fellow we get. I mean, there is a painful thing there, but nevertheless, it is the case that the United Kingdom and the United States remain partners in a whole host of issues. There is an enormous overlap of national interest, particularly when it comes to security and defense policy. And we can see that Trump can be moved if you flatter him, if you cajole him, if you approach him in the right direction, and so on. You can actually make some progress, at least for some period of time. So if you look at Trump's about turn on weapons for Ukraine, releasing a whole tranche of weapon systems this week that will be supplied by the United States to Ukraine, but paid for by European countries. Now, you might say that this isn't the ideal way of going about it, but it's an awful lot better from the Ukraine's point of view, and indeed from European security perspective, it seems to me. It's an awful lot better than the alternative, which was cutting off the American supply of weapons to Ukraine. And so on that, on trade, on a whole host of other issues, the importance of hugging the Americans close, however distasteful it might be, remains quite clear to me. And so Starmer is right to do that, and within that sphere and so on. John Swinney isn't obviously a leading player in this, but he has a role to play as well, and even if that is limited to not rocking the boat, not causing problems.
Yeah, and I mean, the kind of policies which the American president has pursued have had pretty fundamental consequences for the Western alliance. I mean, if he hadn't taken a more isolationist position, if he hadn't raised questions about the amount of money that the United States are pouring up for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we wouldn't be in a position where in European capitals, they're all saying, well, moving to 3% of GDP in terms of defense spending is a given, where they're now talking about moving to 5% of GDP. And that has consequences which will be measured over the next decade or so in the hundreds of billions of pounds. So, what this guy does has absolutely profound consequences. You're right in terms of the Scottish context. If the First Minister was to sort of piss him off, I suppose he could then sort of piss off the Scotch whisky industry. But he does, again, is a man who emotes quite a lot. I was watching his impromptu press conference yesterday before he got onto the helicopter to go to, was it Pennsylvania? I think his photo op
Mm.
was last night. And I mean, it's an extraordinary performance in a sense. No other political leader quite emotes in the way that he does. And, his Scottish mother is a big thing in his life. It is something in that sense, if it can be exploited and it can be exploited for commercial benefits for the country, you can say that it's almost incumbent on the First Minister to do everything to ensure that work and money comes our way. And I'm pretty sure we both know John Swinney. We know the kind of individual that he is. He is a moderately minded guy. He will find most of the characteristics that the president holds to be not very stuff that should be praised at all. But he'll hold his nose. He'll hold his nose, and he will do what is right. Starmer will also hold his nose. But of course, the Donald will then be coming back for that state visit. There's just one issue which has been the subject of some comment in the last week or so, and that, of course, is the costs of this. Given that this is effectively a private visit to visit these golf courses, and it looks as if. Police Scotland, well over a third of their officers are going to be involved in this. There will be officers drafted in from other forces throughout the UK in order to ensure that this visit is completely and utterly secure. I suppose there is an issue of who pays for this ultimately at the end of the day, because Police Scotland will not want this coming out their budget.
But it's good to have to. I mean, they may get some cash from the Home Office possibly, but in general terms, that it's just an operational matter whether Police Scotland welcome it or not. Um, I think the other thing, of course, is that we might mention about Trump and Scotland is that there is a sort of long-standing sort of shroud of embarrassment, I think, at Holyrood over the way that in the past, long before Donald Trump had political ambitions and became president for the first time, let alone the second time, there's a degree of embarrassment at recalling the extent to which successive Scottish governments cozied up to Donald Trump. I think it was Jack McConnell's administration, wasn't it, who put him on a list of so-called global Scots and so on, who would act as sort of proxy ambassadors in some vague, ill-defined fashion that would eventually redound to the country's economic benefit. And then obviously Alex Salmond had a very cosy relationship with Donald Trump for a long time. The initial decision for the golf resort in Aberdeenshire, when the planning committee rejected the application, it was called in very, very swiftly by the Scottish government with the clear intention that it would be overturned. Now, in actual fact, I think in terms of people in the locality, I think most people actually were supportive of the development at the time, and the opposition to it was a relatively minor portion of public sentiment. But nevertheless, the procedural way in which this was done was quite telling. And I suppose there are, if you look again at things that might come up or that would come up if Holyrood was sitting at the moment, because of course it's a summer recess at the moment, I think you would find Green MSPs in particular asking questions of the Scottish government about the relationship between the Scottish government, Prestwick Airport, which is state-owned, and the American military, which uses Prestwick for refueling and various other things and so on, and is actually, in I think some years, has been Prestwick Airport's major client. And what with American foreign policy and particularly events in the Middle East and so on, I think that is the sort of thing that the Greens and other left-wing members of the Scottish Parliament would like to probe the Scottish government on. And so to that extent, I think it is perhaps John Swinney's good fortune that this visit, unofficial as it may be, takes place during the parliamentary holidays.
Well, I don't know what television pictures that we'll get from this, because it is a private visit. But if he's meeting both with the Prime Minister and the First Minister, I'm sure that in terms of the communication point of view from Downing Street and Bute House, they will be looking for some photo opportunities. And I'm sure that both Starmer and Swinney will look sufficiently concerned in any photo opportunities, because you never know what this guy is going to say. You never know when he's going to go off in one. And
Well, he'll be tilting at windmills again because he hates
yes,
he
yes,
hates the windmills and so on. He's the sort
I,
of Don
I,
Quixote
I,
of presidents.
I was about to say, I do recall when he was at a Holyrood committee, he would be asked questions about different aspects of his, the many estate and the plans and all the rest of it. And he just went off on one on windmills, and just time and time and time again. So I suppose, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what pictures we get out of it. Like a lot of stuff with Trump, I dare say that we'll be none the wiser by the end of it. And on the subject matter of none the wiser, last night I settled down to watch the Mansion House speech in
Truly,
preparation
you
for
know how to live, Bernard.
in preparation for this podcast. And I suppose that, Alex, it begs a question. Having listened to this speech, which of course is in front of bankers, it's in front of investment managers, it's in front of the great and the good in the City of London, who get exercised about sort of regulations, and stuff which will impact how they do business, a lot of which is actually very, very technical and from the point of view of the general public unreportable. And indeed, when I flicked between the BBC and ITN last night to see how this was being reported, I did notice that they really were scrabbling around trying to find a line from the speech that was genuinely reportable, that would make sense from the point of view of the ordinary public. It was very, very technical, but on the sort of central, and the mantra yet again, insofar as there was one last night, is growth, 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 growth is what it's all about, and the people in this room can help deliver that growth. And if we can do anything which will assist you in delivering that growth, then we will. But in terms of the direction of travel towards the budget, what it will mean for tax and spend, we didn't really learn anything.
No, no. I mean, I think the broader context of this Mansion House speech from Rachel Reeves is quite significant, however, because I think it was a reflection of the fact that in a considerable degree and quite profoundly, the UK and the British economy continues to exist or to limp along in the shadow of the 2008 financial crisis. That yes, the government has unwound its stakes in the banks that received enormous bailouts, RBS, NatWest, Lloyd's, Halifax, and so on. But nevertheless, the environment in which economic activity, particularly in the City of London, takes place in the UK is still defined to some extent by the reaction to the financial crisis of more than 15 years ago. And so what we saw from Rachel Reeves was an unwinding of some aspects of the regulatory regime that was put in place as a result of 2008 to ensure that nothing like it could ever happen again. And there is a view, I think, in the city and in the financial sector more generally, that however sensible and prudent those reforms in terms of the requirements that banks had to have in terms of their resources and so on, and the separation of retail from investment banking and so on, there's a general sense that however sensible those reforms were, that the creation of this sort of safety net were, that perhaps they have gone on too long or they have outlived their usefulness to some degree. And as a consequence, it would be useful for the sector as a whole, which remains, one of the British economy's great strengths, we should remember, and most important parts of the British economy. That there is a sense that some of these regulatory constraints could be loosened. And so that's what Rachel Reeves has proposed. In addition to, she's also making measures and so on to try and encourage a greater, if you like, civilian investment in the stock market. Other measures to increase loosen certain mortgage lending constraints to allow more first-time buyers on modest to average incomes to have the opportunity to get on the property ladder. All of these are sort of piecemeal initiatives. None of them are revolutionary. There's no sense of a big bang in anything that she said in her Mansion House speech or in the so-called Leeds reforms that she announced. Nevertheless, collectively, you see them sort of inching towards a system whereby, or a recognition that you can have too much regulation, and that regulation that gets in the way of enterprise is a problem, and that regulation can sometimes be too cautious. So again, it's like you don't want to have an overreaction in terms of deregulating absolutely everything. But there is this recognition that Britain is sort of stuffed up, bunged up, an increasingly sclerotic economy where it's very difficult to get anything done. And so you see a consistency of approach, at least in theory. We'll see whether this is followed through in practice. A loosening of regulatory constraints in the city, a loosening of regulatory constraints when it comes to the planning system in England and Wales, with a view to getting Britain building again, particularly houses, but also large-scale infrastructure projects, and that a recognition that too much regulation can constrain growth. Since the economy is not growing at the moment, you can see why the Treasury is looking desperately for any levers that can be pulled whatsoever, and hoping that pulling them actually produces some kind of result. Because we've had no economic growth in the last 2 months. Figures out this week show inflation ticking up, the CPI index of inflation up to 3.6%, which in turn probably reduces the likelihood of an interest rate cut at the Bank of England's next meeting on, I think it's August the 7th, which in turn will inform pre-budget speculation and the room for manoeuvre that the Chancellor has, which is already limited, and everybody is anticipating tax increases in the budget and spending restraint in unprotected departments, etc., etc., etc. So technical as all these things may be, they are also actually extremely significant because they will tell us far more about the government's ability to achieve its ambitions than any number of parliamentary occasions.
Yeah, the BBC sort of reporting of this online was on in relation to ISAs, which have rather bizarrely become a political hot potato. Why? Because Rachel Reeves, and I think the figure of the amount of money that's held in ISAs by tens of millions of people in the UK is something like £300 billion. Now, what she has been keen to do is to say, well, we should be levering some of that money into investment. And if we lever it into investment, it will lead to economic growth. Now, that's all, I think, fine and dandy. And I think that makes actually a lot of sense. But with so much of what this government does, it seems to sort of operate by knee jerk. So, yeah, we want to reform welfare, but by the way, we'll just take 5 billion out the system, and we'll make the system fit the numbers. Again, with this kind of ISA reform, this is actually, I think, been pretty damaging for the government because over 20 million people in the UK actually hold an ISA, and it's the kind of thing, because they've got a vested interest in, they will follow what politicians are saying. And over the last 6 months, we've had newspapers report that definitively, almost, that the ISA allowance of 20,000 was going to be cut all the way down to 4,000. That the Chancellor wanted people to have cash ISAs to move into stocks and shares ISAs, and particularly into stocks and shares ISAs where you would be investing in UK stocks, which would lead to investment and lead to growth. Now, again, that makes sense in terms of logic up to a certain point. But the mistake that she actually makes is that they start trailing this stuff without having spoken to anyone. So, in the intervening period, we've had the banks basically say to her, this ain't going to work, partly because 80% of people who hold cash ISAs are completely risk averse. It is why they hold cash ISAs and not stocks and shares ISAs, and therefore the idea that they'll just transfer their allowance into stocks and shares ISAs ain't going to work. And incidentally, if they decide not to continue to invest in ISAs because they're not getting the return, that will affect, in particular, the liquidity of building societies, which will have a knock on effect on people getting mortgage applications accepted. So, this is bad in a whole series of ways. Now, I think that that was particularly foreseeable. But again, these kind of policies are floated without being thought through. Now, what she did say specifically on this last night is that there will be a financial product up and running for the tax year 2026 2027. Which I think is probably going to be the confirmation of this British ISA, which there'll be an ISA product which will be about investing in British companies. So we've already got
And
cash
infrastructure funds and so on as well,
and
I think.
infrastructure funds, and there will be an appeal in that sense made to people to invest in that. Just whether or not that's going to be more financially attractive than other ISAs, I know not. But that should have been the policy altogether, because as I say, we've had a situation where we were more or less being briefed that the ISA allowance in relation to cash ISAs at least has had its day. Then they were talking with financial institutions. And then it was even being briefed that she would use the speech last night to absolutely confirm that there would be nothing happening in relation to the 20,000 allowance. She didn't really do that. She sort of tended to skirt over it.
Mm.
So, on that kind of thing, again, bad political management of a message, bad political management which affects the over 20 million people in the UK, all of them, if not most of them, who have votes in an election, thinking, what is it that she's up to? It's just, it's crass political management from the government yet again. But I think that the interesting thing is that a lot of people in that room last night who will be traditionally, I mean, as Tory as they come, nevertheless, I think, welcomed the election of a Labour government just over a year ago, because all of the noises that she was making, in a sense, struck a chord with people within the city. And there was a sense in which they thought that the Conservatives were tired, not only tired, but incompetent, and it was time for a change. Just over a year in, and the applause were polite, and most of the applause is when she was name checking other people who were doing various bits and pieces of reviews in terms of deregulation. They've very, very quickly fallen out of love with her. And I think this could get even worse in terms of the relationship with business, because it is now, I think, pretty obvious that the budget later on this year is going to see more tax rises, perhaps even more tax rises on business.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think once you rule out increasing national insurance, VAT, or income tax for quote ordinary working people unquote, then well, you run out of other places to turn. And again, we come back to the problem that the government has, which is it does have a message it can tell, a story it could tell. It could talk about how, yes, it has increased tax, but it has increased spending too. It is a dramatic increase in the minimum wage, a genuine boon for the low paid. No austerity. Uh, it has a message it can sell on these things, but that isn't the dominant narrative that's coming out of Downing Street, and it's certainly not one that is really accepted by the general public as a whole at present. And again, you have this difficulty, which is the economic growth is the only answer to the long-term fiscal challenges that the United Kingdom faces, and the Office for Budget Responsibility is absolutely clear that these are really that the scale, breadth, and depth of these long-term challenges is quite extraordinary and unprecedented in the last half century. At least. And so you have this thing that, okay, economic growth is the only way we can get out of this, that we can increase tax receipts, and then we can then in time move towards a balanced budget, or at least only running a deficit of 1 or 2% of GDP. And we can reduce debt interest payments as a share of government spending, because I mean last year debt interest was about 9% of government spending. And that is a real problem over a prolonged period of time. You can get away with that 1 year, but you can't be having that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years in succession. So economic growth is the only way you could do it. And then you raise a whole load of taxes on business, and you make it much more expensive to employ people. And we have the problem again and again, long-standing British problem of sluggish productivity growth relative to European peer countries. And how do you actually get out of this vicious circle? And it is extremely difficult when you're taxing the very things you know that you're banking on to get you out of it. And that is a sort of contradiction at the heart of the government's approach that I think is unresolvable.
Yeah, I mean, I had dinner with a friend on Saturday night, and he used to have a chain of pubs in the west of Scotland. He's about to retire, so he'd one pub left in Leafy Milngavie, I think it was,
Mhm.
and he sold that recently. And he said that the changes which were made in the budget in terms of the minimum wage and in terms of national insurance contributions, lowering the threshold at which they become payable, and then increasing the rate for his business, for his one pub alone, meant an additional £18,000 to find in that particular year. I have a friend who just closed down his barber shop in the Merchant City in Glasgow, who was paying in terms of for the lease and business rates in excess of £43,000 per year. And these are the people, in a sense, and these are small business people, in a sense. The blood transfusion in any economy. They account for a lot of economic activity, who are simply saying we cannot deal with these costs, which is why the last budget was probably inflationary, has led to higher levels of unemployment. And her problem is because they made daft promises in opposition in order to get through an election, they've completely boxed themselves in. But you're right in terms of the challenges which governments face. I think in the last podcast, I gave that figure that if nothing else happens and you accept the triple lock will be with us forever and a day, that benefits will be with us forever and a day, that you accept all of the projections about the number of
Mm.
people who will go on to welfare in the years to come, and defence spending goes the way that it's going, and health spending goes the way that it's going, then the national debt in terms of national income by the year 2070 will be 270% of national income. It's currently 100% of national income. It'll be 270%. So when economists talk about things being unsustainable, there's the statistic that tells you that it's unsustainable. And of course, as you point out, the CPI inflation figure this morning, 3.6%. That means that by the time we get to September, given where the forecasts were on this a couple of months ago, the chances are that 3.6% plus will be the figure for September, and that is the figure which is the baseline figure for uprating benefits, for uprating that aspect of the triple lock if CPI inflation is the highest bit of the triple lock, and is your benchmark for public sector pay. This goes on and on and on, and at some point, some government will run out of road, because the only way that they can plug the gap is to go to the bond markets to borrow. But when the bond markets see that successive governments, and this is not a party political point against the Labour government, but when successive governments start to rack up this level of debt, they will only loan at very punitive interest rates, or they will say, you are headed in such a direction as that you may well not pay this back, so we're not loaning you the money. We bang on about this on this podcast all the time. In a sense, it's the central theme. Politicians have the right to set out their stall, tell you what policies they want to fund, but they're only really realistic if they're affordable in the long term. And if they fully fund one set of policies in one area, that money cannot be spent in another area. So by the time we get to the budget later on in the year, it is perfectly clear that the freeze on the personal allowance is going to continue. I think they'll continue it for another 2 to 3 years because it's the easy hit. I think they may well look at fuel duty. I think they will revisit the issue of inheritance tax. But before the end of this parliament, my firm prediction is that one of those taxes, the taxes on working people, which the Prime Minister at question time last week made clear yet again they will not touch. Here's the prediction: they will, because they'll run
I,
out of room.
I think they have to. And so, I mean, politically, they have not won the argument in the way that David Cameron and George Osborne won the argument in 2010. Because remember, again, 2010, the elections, just after the great crash of 2008. And Osborne and Cameron laid the ground for what they were going to do in office. They said, well, look, a period of retrenchment is required to recover from this enormously costly crisis. And so that means, yes, we are going to have austerity. We are not going to be spending cash the way previous governments have, or the way we would like to. We have to bring the deficit down. We have to get the public finances in order. We have to fix the roof. Labour failed to fix it when the sun was shining. Now it's pouring with rain. We've got to fix it now. Now, you can disagree with the measures that George Osborne took as Chancellor. You can say that they had a very damaging long-term impact on public services in the United Kingdom. You can say all of that. That's a separate argument. The argument I'm making here is that they won the political argument for the right to do all of that. They persuaded the public that this was an acceptable and indeed, in many cases, a necessary approach. And so they got a mandate to do it. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves were not nearly as frank as that in the run up to last year's general election. And they have not won the public legitimacy for their approach. And it may be that it would have been impossible to roll the pitch in that sense, to lay the ground for what they would like to do, because the public mood is different from what it was in 2010. We've had 15 years of very unhappy politics at a British level. And so the public mood for, if you like, further sacrifices or for recognizing the depth of the fiscal predicament in which the United Kingdom finds itself in is not what it was in 2010, when voters were perhaps more prepared to accept gloomy news of this sort. Because at the moment, you have a situation where, out of the 36 countries in the OECD, the UK is the only one that is in the top six in terms of highest deficit, annual deficit, highest rate of debt to GDP, and highest cost of government borrowing. You can get away with one of those things being bad, if you like, being a top tier country in one of those things, but to be at the top end of the table in all three has a
Mm.
multiplier effect that is extraordinarily damaging. And that is the problem that we find ourselves in. And the government hasn't really prepared the ground for it. A lot of Labour MPs aren't prepared to accept the reality of the fiscal position, not just this year, but looking 10 years into the future. And the voters certainly aren't as well. Now, that may be, as I say, partly because the public sentiment just isn't where it was in 2010. But it's also the case that Cameron and Osborne played their hand better than Starmer and Reeves have played theirs, in my view.
Yes, and my view is that no politician um, of any party, and in the context of an independent Scotland, Scotland
Ooh.
would be facing some scary choices. I don't see any evidence that any political party and any political leader is remotely going to get to grips with this. But we will no doubt talk about this another time.
Let's move on
Well,
to other things. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have just had my breakfast, and I had a fried egg, and I had a fried square slice sausage from the butcher's, and I had a lovely piece of fried black pudding. Now, I wouldn't get very far in MasterChef.
No nonsense, Bernard. Bernard, clearly you have all that it takes to be a contestant on the next edition of Celebrity MasterChef.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Stick it in a fry. Stick
If
it in a
Kirsty,
frying pan and turn it.
if Kirsty Walk can do this, you can as well.
So, yes, MasterChef is the latest crisis afflicting the BBC. We don't need to get into the business of Greg Wallace and John Turod just to say that it's a complete and utter mess. But just on specifically the MasterChef issue, the series which they have in the can, which they're now debating what to do with, cost £8 million. And of course, this is a series which is a big money spinner for the BBC. So to can it and do nothing comes at a very, very, very heavy financial cost. But I think it's sort of symptomatic of how badly the BBC handles things, that as a minimum, they can't say, well, we're going to decide what we're going to do with everything that's been shot, and there's a series there ready to go. But given that we've effectively fired both of the presenters, one for alleged racism and one for a whole series of misdemeanors involving allegations from over 50 different individuals that these two presenters have fallen short of the values that we would expect from our presenters. As an
What would Lord
absolute
Reith, what would Lord Reith have to say about it all?
Yeah, yes. I mean, as a very minimum, and they can't even say this. Whatever else happens with the series that we've filmed, it is not credible to have these two presenters fronting it. So they may well be able to do a re-edit job, I'm not sure, or to take all the footage and repackage it in a different way in order that the contestants, and this is life changing for these contestants that go into these programs, don't feel that they've completely and utterly wasted their time. But here is a crisis which effectively involves the sacking of two presenters, and the BBC, even now, are incapable of saying, well, we'll decide what we're going to do with the series, but by the way, it is clearly not appropriate that these two individuals that we have sacked are not actually in it. They can't even say that. and it begs a question whether or not they're ever capable of putting their own house in order when they try to manage these particular issues. And it is quite serious because in the entire history of the BBC, I can't think of a situation where trust in the BBC is pretty low, where it is being assailed politically from both sides. In the past, there was the fallout with the Wilson government. Well, not the Wilson government. They fell out with Harold Wilson over a documentary called Yesterday's Men, which was made by David Dimbleby in 1971. And Harold Wilson bore a grudge against the BBC for quite some time. Margaret Thatcher fell out with them over the Panorama programme, Maggie's Militant Tendency, and then the brouhaha over the Real Lives documentaries about putting people with links to paramilitary organizations in documentaries. There's always a sense in which the BBC, when it does stuff, is controversial, sometimes controversial for the right reasons. They were absolutely right in some of the programs which they made, which have offended politicians. I have no problem with that at all. But these are things which always died down. There is now a sense that when you go from Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris, and in editorial terms, the real, really problematic one for them, the Martin Bashir one, which took 20 years to actually get to the truth of what actually happened there. And then the Gaza documentary, and then MasterChef, and Hugh Edwards, and it's one after another. There's never been an occasion when the BBC have faced a crisis like this, and it's a crisis which is now, I think, filtering through to the audience, some of whom believe that it is irredeemably left wing, irredeemably woke, and other
Mm,
people on the other side of
mm,
the spectrum who think that it's simply a mouthpiece for the political right. And the reality is this. Um, 99% of what the BBC do, I think they do well and they get right. The problem is that in the kind of age in which they live, they have to get 100% right.
mm.
And the people who work for the BBC are badly let down by a series of incompetent middle managers and sometimes people at the top who respond too slowly, have as their end game protecting the institution and protecting the brand, and not doing what it should do in all circumstances when it deals with difficulty. If the circumstances are difficult, get them out, take it on the chin, explain yourself, and move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, I agree with a lot of that, and so particularly the way in which the BBC responds to, if you like, difficulties within the BBC. I think it is extraordinary that for much of this week and so on, the lead story on the 6 o'clock news on the BBC has been the BBC talking about the BBC. When everything else that's going on in the world, I think that is a remarkably solipsistic news judgment that doesn't do the BBC any favors. But the bigger problem for the BBC is the unique way in which it is funded. It is effectively funded by a poll tax on households. And that means that the BBC has to offer something to everybody. But by doing so, it makes life very, very difficult for itself, because is it a public sector broadcaster? Yes. So it has to do stuff, it has to do things that commercial broadcasters would not do, because there isn't necessarily much in the way of a market value for it. So it has to do that. On the other hand, it also has to act as a commercial broadcaster itself, not just in terms of selling programs overseas, which is an increasingly important income stream for the BBC, but also to justify the license fee. It has to make things that programs on the television and radio and podcasts and on the web and all the rest of it and so on, that are just as popular, if not more popular, than their than comparable programs made by commercial broadcasters. Because if you didn't do that, if you didn't create stuff that people actually want to watch, how could you justify the license fee? And that is, if you like, the dilemma in which the BBC is trapped. And I think there is actually no real way out of that dilemma in a media age in which the media landscape is so fragmented. You have people under the age of 30, I think, who do not watch any linear television, if you like. They watch on streaming services and they watch on demand, but they are not as likely to watch or consume BBC news, BBC documentaries, BBC dramas, and so on as older people are. And so again, longer term, how do you actually justify the license fee if people aren't accessing and using the BBC, which from a news point of view, remains the single most powerful and dominant media organization in Britain. People talk now, you may say I would say this, but people talk about Rupert Murdoch and Lord Rothermere and others and so on, the press barons and so on, as though they have the commanding heights of the British media and so on. They do not. The BBC is the great elephant in the room, the only media organization that everybody watches at least a little bit some of the time. And so what the BBC does and how it behaves and how it goes about its work and the judgments it makes, the editorial judgments it makes, are legitimate matters of public concern and interest because, again, of the unique way in which the BBC is funded, which is both its great source of strength as the national broadcaster and its great source of weakness, because it makes them beholden to a whole range of contradictory demands that in the long run tie the BBC up in knots.
Yeah, I think we've given that a good go today, 45 minutes in. Just a couple of final thoughts on the BBC stuff. A poll tax on TV watching is a good way to put it. It's completely and utterly unsustainable, the license fee. Their income is almost 4 billion a year, although I noticed that I think 300,000 fewer people actually paid the license last year. So they're going to have to get a funding model and they're going to have to get it soon. But on the element of trust, which in a sense goes right to the heart of what this institution is about, if people lose trust in it, it's dead. If people don't trust what you're actually telling them, then you will die. It really is as simple as that. And on the issue of complaints, whether it be about individuals, whether it be about programs, there really is a need to take this out with the hallmarks of internal processes within the BBC and something ending up in the Director General's desk, because the suspicion will always be at the end of the day, even although they will get people from outside to establish facts and all the rest of it, the suspicion will be that it's the BBC who marks the BBC's homework, and nobody should trust a system like that. And I don't know where we will be in the years to come. I got my license fee thing in yesterday, my TV license. I happily pay it because for all of its faults, and there are a lot of faults, the alternative of moving to a subscription service where news becomes a form of infotainment really would be bad. If we think the public are badly informed at the moment and badly served by a lot of our media, if the landscape changes and becomes more like the US model, then we will have lost all hope.
Well, on the question of being informed and so on, and trust and so on, listeners can, of course, be assured that they can trust the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. They do not have to agree with what we say, but they can trust us to just tell us as we see it, without fear or favour or party political partisanship. And long may that remain the case. Thank you very much for being with us, for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back next week with another one. But for the time being, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.